she spilled coffee on a stranger, he turned out to be a mafia boss. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The scent of burnt coffee and stale rain was the perfume of life, a constant, cloying reminder of her exhaustion. For 6 months, the clatter of ceramic on saucer and the hiss of the espresso machine had been the soundtrack to her frantic escape, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched taut over a chasm of fear. She moved through the afternoon rush at the daily grind with an economy of motion born of desperation, her eyes darting towards the rain-streaked windows every few seconds. Each shadow that flickered in her periphery, each man who lingered too long on the sidewalk, sent a jolt of ice through her veins. He could be anywhere. Marco was a creature of obsession, and she and her son, Leo, were the sole focus of that terrible fixation. She had left him with nothing but the clothes on her back and a 6-year-old's hand clutched tightly in hers, but she knew that wouldn't be enough to deter a man who considered her his property. A man outside huddled under a black umbrella, turned his head. For a heart-stopping second, the sharp line of his jaw and the breadth of his shoulders mirrored Marco's. His breath hitched, a tiny panic sound lost in the din. Her hand trembled, and the tray she was carrying, 2 cappuccinos and an Americano, all scalding hot, tilted precariously. She tried to correct her balance, her worn server's shoes skidding on a damp spot on the tile, but her momentum was already lost. She stumbled forward, a silent scream trapped in her throat, and collided with a wall of solid muscle. The tray flew from her grasp, and the world seemed to slow down as the 3 ceramic cups arced through the air, their dark contents painting a disastrous mural across the front of an exquisitely tailored charcoal suit. The entire fell silent. The man she had crashed into didn't so much as flinch, his stillness an unnerving anchor in the chaos. Stared horrified at the dark, spreading stain on the impossibly expensive fabric, the smell of hot coffee now sharp and acrid. Her mind raced, calculating the cost of the suit, the dry cleaning, the inevitable shouting, the manager firing her on the spot. It was a disaster of a magnitude she couldn't afford, another crack in the fragile foundation of the life she was trying to build for Leo. Her apology tumbled out, a frantic, breathless stream of words. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I'm so clumsy, I wasn't looking. I'll get napkins, I can try to clean it, I'm so sorry." She expected shouting, she expected condescension, a public humiliation that would leave her shaking. What she did not expect was the silence that followed or the eyes that finally met hers. They were the color of dark, aged whiskey, and they held an unnerving, analytical calm. He wasn't angry. He was watching her, as if she were a complex puzzle he was patiently disassembling. He was tall, with dark hair cut with severe precision, and a face that looked as though it were carved from unforgiving stone, all sharp angles and controlled lines. Yet there was a compelling severity to his beauty that was both intimidating and magnetic. Behind him, a shorter, stockier man with a perpetually grim expression stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "Are you blind? This suit is worth more than this entire garbage. We need your name, your information. The boss will be sending you the bill for the damages." The word boss sent a fresh wave of panic through. Information, her name, and address. It was a paper trail, a breadcrumb for Marco to follow. Her entire existence was a carefully constructed lie built on cash payments, expired IDs, and a constant, vigilant anonymity. To give them her real name was to hand Marco a map directly to her and Leo. Her survival instincts, honed by 2 years of abuse and 6 months on the run, took over. She straightened her shoulders, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Of course," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "My name is Anna." Anna, the name came from a character in a book she'd read to Leo last night. "My phone number is 555-0182, a disconnected line she'd memorized for just such an emergency. The man in the ruined suit didn't look at his associate. His gaze remained fixed on her, and for the first time a flicker of something other than cool observation entered his expression. It was a faint, almost imperceptible shift at the corners of his mouth, the barest hint of a smile. It wasn't a kind smile or a warm one, it was knowing. It was the smile of a predator that has just seen its prey make a fascinating, unexpected move, he knew. In that instant was certain that this man, with his unreadable eyes and unnerving stillness, knew she was lying. He saw the desperation she was trying so desperately to conceal, the raw animal fear that propelled her through each day. A man like this, a man who wore suits that cost more than her rent for a year and had associates who called him boss, was not accustomed to being lied to. Her lie should have angered him, insulted him. Instead, it seemed to intrigue him. He raised a hand, a quiet gesture that immediately silenced his subordinate. "Leave it," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It was calm, measured, and carried an authority that was absolute. He finally broke his gaze from looking down at the coffee-soaked fabric of his suit as if it were a minor inconvenience, a fly to be swatted away. He didn't seem to care about the suit at all. He cared about her, about the lie she had just told, about the terror swimming in her wide, frightened eyes. He looked back at her one last time, his whiskey-colored eyes sweeping over her from her messy bun to her worn-out shoes. He wasn't just looking, he was committing her to memory. Every detail, every flaw, every tremor of her lip. Then with a curt nod to his man, he turned and walked out of the, leaving standing in a puddle of spilled coffee and a silence more terrifying than any shouting could have been. She watched him disappear into a sleek black car that materialized at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the weeping sky. The car pulled away with a silent, deadly grace and was left with the chilling certainty that her small, clumsy accident had just connected her fate to a man far more dangerous than the one she was running from. Fear was a taste knew intimately. It was the metallic tang of blood in her mouth after one of Marco's rages, the sour bile that rose in her throat when she heard footsteps behind her on a dark street. But the fear that settled in her bones after the incident at the was different. It was a cold, quiet dread, the feeling of being watched by an unseen predator. For 24 hours she went through the motions of her life, her senses screamingly alert. She held Leo's hand a little on the walk to and from his school, she triple-checked the flimsy lock on her apartment door, and she scanned the faces of every customer at the, half expecting to see those whiskey-colored eyes watching her from a shadowy corner. She knew the name Anna and the fake number would not be a shield. A man like that didn't need information to be handed to him, he would simply take it. The confirmation of her fears came not with a bang but with a chilling display of quiet omnipresence. The next evening, as she was walking up the crumbling concrete steps to her apartment building, a place that reeked of damp and despair, a familiar, hated voice called her name. Marco. He stepped out from the shadows of the alley beside her building and her blood ran cold. He looked thinner, his face gaunt and his eyes burning with a feverish possession. He had found her. The 6 months of running, of sleeping in shelters, of scrubbing floors and serving coffee had all been for nothing. You can't hide from me, he sneered, taking a step towards her. You and the boy belong to me. She backed away, her hand fumbling in her purse for the pepper spray she always carried, but before she could grasp it, 2 figures emerged from the gloom behind Marco. They were unremarkable men in dark coats, their faces impassive, but they moved with a synchronized, predatory stillness that was terrifyingly familiar. They didn't speak. They didn't touch Marco. They simply flanked him, their presence an invisible cage. Marco, who had built his life on intimidation and brute force, seemed to shrink before them. His bluster evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of a lesser predator facing an apex one. He shot one last look, a promise of retribution in his eyes, before turning and practically fleeing into the night. The 2 men watched him go, then melted back into the shadows as silently as they had appeared. Was left standing on the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs, understanding with sickening clarity that she had not been protected by chance. She had been protected by the man in the charcoal suit. The next morning he was waiting for her outside he stood leaning against the same black car, this time dressed in a perfectly pressed navy suit, looking utterly out of place and yet completely in command of the grimy city street. He pushed off the car as she approached, his movements fluid and precise. He said, it wasn't a question. My name is, he didn't offer to shake her hand, he simply watched her, his expression as unreadable as ever. We need to talk. He opened the back door of the car, an invitation that felt like a summons. Inside, she could see the plush leather interior, a world away from the cracked vinyl of the city bus. Her every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab Leo and disappear again, but she knew it was pointless. He had found her once, he would find her again. He had dealt with Marco with 2 silent men. Running was no longer an option. Defeated, she slid into the car. The interior was silent and smelled of rich leather and something clean and masculine, the scent of money and power, got in beside her and the car pulled away from the curb. He didn't speak for several minutes, allowing the silence to stretch to amplify her fear. Finally, he turned to her. I know about Marco, he said, his voice low and even. I know what you're running from, and I know it's only a matter of time before he tries something more drastic. He presented a plain manila folder, laying it on the seat between them. I have an offer for you, a job, administrative assistant at my company, Global Logistics. The salary is more than you make in a year at that. It also comes with a corporate apartment, fully furnished, state-of-the-art security, in a building my company owns. Stared at him, bewildered. Why would you do this? Because I spilled coffee on you? It was absurd, it made no sense. This was a transaction and she couldn't see what she had to offer a man like him. His lips curved into that same small, enigmatic smile. Let's just say I have a vested interest in mitigating messes. You created one and I have determined that this is the most efficient way to clean it up. Your former life is a liability. I am offering you an alternative. He was offering her a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. She would be trading one owner for another, a violent, predictable one for a man whose power was so vast and quiet it was infinitely more terrifying. I don't want your help, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It is not help, he corrected her gently, his whiskey eyes pinning her in place. It is a solution. Think of your son, think of Leo, a good school, a safe place to sleep, a life where you aren't constantly looking over your shoulder. Can you give him that on your own with Marco hunting you? The mention of Leo's name was a physical blow, had done his research. He knew her weakness, the one thing in the world she would sacrifice anything for. He wasn't asking her, he was telling her. This was not a negotiation. She saw the truth of her situation laid bare in the cold, hard gleam of his eyes. She was trapped. Her resistance was a futile gesture, a bird beating its wings against the bars of its cage. Taking a shuddering breath, she gave a single, jerky nod. Okay. The life he gave her was as sterile and perfect as his suits. The apartment was on the 30th floor of a gleaming glass tower with panoramic views of a city she had only ever seen from the gutter. It was filled with elegant, minimalist furniture that felt cold to the touch. The job was real in a hushed, intimidating office where people spoke in low tones and moved with purpose. She filed papers, answered phones, and tried to disappear into the beige walls, but she was always aware of him. Sometimes she would feel his eyes on her as she walked through the office, a prickling on the back of her neck that was both unsettling and, to her shame, strangely reassuring. He had given her safety, an impenetrable fortress for her and Leo, but in doing so, he had taken her life. She was his now, a piece on his chessboard, and she was drawn to the terrifying, magnetic pull of his power, a moth fluttering dangerously close to a flame she knew could incinerate her. The illusion of safety, however gilded, was a fragile thing. Learned this on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the sun casts long shadows and the air holds a deceptive chill. She was watching Leo play in the manicured private park attached to their new apartment building, a small, perfect square of green in a concrete forest. He was laughing, his small face bright with a joy she hadn't seen since before they'd fled. For a moment she allowed herself to relax, to believe in the life had constructed for them. That was her mistake. A man sat on a bench across the playground, partially obscured by a newspaper, but there was something in the way he held himself, a coiled tension that set her teeth on edge. Then he lowered the paper and her world stopped. It was Marco. He smiled, a twisted, triumphant smirk that made her stomach heave. He had found them even here in the heart of his fortress. Before she could scream, before she could run to Leo, two men, the building's security men, were on him. It was brutally efficient. One moment Marco was there, a promise of violence in his eyes. The next he was being lifted to his feet, an arm twisted behind his back, and hustled away towards an unmarked van that had pulled up to the curb. Leo hadn't even noticed. He was still laughing, chasing a butterfly across the perfect lawn, but was shaking uncontrollably, the carefully constructed walls of her new life crumbling around her. This prison wasn't secure enough. That night came to the apartment. He didn't knock, he let himself in with his own key, a silent reminder of his ownership of her life. He found her sitting in the dark, staring out at the city lights, the skyline a glittering tapestry of a world she didn't belong to. He didn't offer empty comforts or platitudes. He simply stood behind her, his presence a heavy weight in the room. "He won't bother you again," he said, his voice a low rumble in the silence. "Ever." Turned to face him, her fear finally boiling over into anger. "What does that mean? What did you do to him? Did you kill him?" The thought was horrifying, yet a dark, treacherous part of her hoped it was true. His expression remained impassive. "Death is messy, it creates problems, investigations. There are cleaner, more permanent solutions." He explained it with the dispassionate air of a CEO discussing a hostile takeover. He hadn't laid a finger on Marco. Instead, he had made a few phone calls. Anonymous tips were sent to the narcotics division about Marco's side dealings. A rival crew, the Alleys, were given precise information about a shipment Marco was planning to hijack from them. His assets were frozen due to a sudden, aggressive audit from a financial crimes unit had on his payroll. Within hours, Marco's life had been systematically and utterly dismantled. He was either in a police interrogation room or running for his life from men far more dangerous than himself. He was erased. The cold, ruthless efficiency of it all was more terrifying than any simple act of violence. This was the true nature of his power. It wasn't just brute force, it was a vast, intricate web of influence that could crush a man without leaving a single fingerprint. Stared at him, seeing the monster and the savior all at once. The conflict tore through her, and she finally broke. The tears she had held back for months, for years, came in a torrent, great heaving sobs of terror and grief and a profound, soul-deep relief. She crumpled to the floor, and for the first time, iron control seemed to falter. He knelt in front of her, his movements stiff and uncertain, as if he were confronted with an equation he couldn't solve. "He told me," she choked out, the words ripped from her throat. "He told me that I was nothing without him, that he had made me and he could unmake me. He hit me and then he would cry and say he couldn't live without me. He made me feel like I was the crazy one." She poured out the whole ugly story, the years of manipulation, the isolation, the constant fear that had become the air she breathed. She told him everything, expecting him to recoil, to be disgusted by the pathetic mess of her past. Instead, he listened, his whiskey-colored eyes never leaving her face. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper, the room was thick with a heavy, charged silence. Then he did something she never would have anticipated. He slowly, deliberately unbuttoned the cuff of his left sleeve and rolled it up his forearm. There, stark against the tan skin, was a long, jagged scar, white and puckered with age. It was an ugly, violent mark. "My father," said, his voice devoid of emotion yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of pain. He believed that strength was forged through fear. He was the head of our family. He wanted to make sure I was strong enough to one day take his place. He gave me this when I was 12 because I showed mercy to a man who had failed him. He told me mercy was a weakness that would get me killed. He looked from the scar back to her, and for the first time she saw a crack in his marble. She saw not the powerful CEO or the feared mafia boss, but the 12-year-old boy who had been taught that cruelty was a virtue. I swore that day, he continued, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it, that I would be stronger than him, not by being more cruel but by being in control. And I swore that no man under my watch would ever raise a hand to a woman or a child. It is not mercy, it is order. In that moment the chasm between them vanished. She was no longer just his ward, and he was no longer just her protector. They were two damaged souls forged in the fires of different yet similar hells. She saw the wound he kept hidden beneath his tailored suits and his iron will, a wound that mirrored her own. Without thinking, she reached out, her trembling fingers tracing the raised line of his scar. His skin was warm. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible tremor, but he didn't pull away. He held her gaze, and in the depths of his eyes she saw not a monster, but a man who had built an empire to protect the broken boy still hiding inside him. And in her touch he felt not pity, but an acceptance he had never known. The bond between them, forged in fear and necessity, was now sealed in the crucible of shared pain. The confession, the shared revelation of scars both seen and unseen, irrevocably altered the space between them. The careful distance had always maintained dissolved, replaced by a charged intimacy that hummed in the air whenever he was near. The fear felt had not vanished, but it had changed its shape, twisting into a dangerous, thrilling current of attraction. He was no longer just the architect of her gilded cage, he was its sole occupant with her, a fellow prisoner of his own past. He started coming to the apartment not just to check on her security, but to see her. They would talk for hours after Leo was asleep, their conversations drifting from books and politics to more personal, guarded territories. She learned he had a dry, unexpected wit. He learned she had a strength that went far beyond mere survival. The first time he kissed her, it was on the balcony of her apartment, the city lights spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a release of months of pent-up tension and unspoken desire. It was the kiss of a man starved for a connection he never believed he could have. Met his hunger with her own, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. In his arms, she felt a different kind of safety, not the passive security of high walls and bodyguards, but the active, fierce protection of a man who saw all of her, the broken, the frightened, the resilient, and wanted her anyway. Their romance became a secret, incandescent thing, a fire burning brightly in the cold, sterile world he had built. He was a different man with her, his voice softer, the hard lines of his face easing when he looked at her or Leo. He would sit on the floor and help Leo build elaborate Lego castles, his brow furrowed in concentration, and in those moments could almost forget the empire of shadows he commanded. He promised her a future. Standing on that same balcony one night, his arms wrapped around her from behind, he whispered it against her hair. "You and Leo will never be afraid again. I'll burn the world down before I let anyone harm you." She believed him. She felt the raw, absolute power of his conviction, but as the days turned into weeks, she began to understand the true price of that promise. Her life was no longer her own. A driver took her everywhere. Her calls were monitored. When an old friend from a previous city tried to get in touch, she was politely but firmly informed by one of his men that the association was not advisable. Leo couldn't go to the local public school. A private tutor came to the apartment every day. He couldn't have sleepovers or with children she hadn't met, and any potential friend's family was subjected to a background check that would have shamed the CIA. She was safe, Leo was safe, but were they free? The question gnawed at her, a bitter counterpoint to the genuine love that was growing between her and. She confronted him one evening, her voice trembling with a frustration she could no longer contain. "I feel like I'm suffocating. This isn't a life, it's a beautifully decorated prison. I traded one man controlling my every move for another." The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. He didn't get angry. He simply looked at her with a profound, weary sadness. "This is the only way I know how to protect what I care about. The world I live in has rules. Enemies, they look for weakness, for leverage. You and the boy, you are my leverage now. Your freedom is the price for your safety. I wish it were different." His words were a chilling prophecy. The other powerful families in the city, who had long maintained a tense but stable peace with the organization, had taken notice of Snoo's preoccupation. A woman, a child, to men like them, love wasn't a strength, it was a fatal liability. The family, old rivals with a thirst for greater power, decided to test the boundaries. It started small. One of his cargo shipments from the port was hijacked, a bold and bloody affair that left 3 of his men dead. Then a restaurant known to be under his protection was firebombed. These were messages written in blood and fire intended for him. The danger was no longer an abstract concept she had to be shielded from. It was a palpable threat, its tendrils creeping closer to their door. The tension in became a physical thing. He was away more often, his nights filled with meetings that she knew weren't about logistics or corporate strategy. When he came home, he smelled of cold night air and cigar smoke, and the darkness in his eyes was deeper, more pronounced. The tender lover was retreating, and the ruthless Don was taking his place. Would lie awake at night, listening to the silence of the apartment, and wonder if by accepting this man's love she had not saved her son from a simple thug, but had instead placed him directly in the crossfire of a war she could not begin to comprehend. The final assault came not with the subtlety of a corporate maneuver, but with the brutal directness of a predator aiming for the heart. The Falcons, emboldened by seemingly measured response to their provocations, made the gravest miscalculation of their lives. They decided the leverage needed to be taken, not just threatened. It happened on a Tuesday. The private tutor was ill and, yearning for a sliver of normalcy, had convinced to let her take Leo to the city's grand public library, flanked by two of his most trusted men, Dante and Sal. The library was a cavern of quiet reverence, a place where felt she could almost breathe again. But as they were leaving, descending the wide marble steps to the street where their car was waiting, the world erupted into chaos. Two sedans screeched to a halt, boxing their car in. Four men, their faces grim and professional, emerged with guns drawn. It wasn't a sloppy street hit, it was a coordinated military-style abduction. Dante and Sal reacted instantly, pushing and Leo behind them, drawing their own weapons. The sound of gunfire echoed off the stone of the library, sharp and deafening. His world narrowed to a single, terrifying focus: Leo. She wrapped her body around him, pulling him down behind a large stone lion, his small whimpers muffled against her chest. She saw Dante go down, a spray of blood against the pale marble. She saw Sal fighting valiantly, but he was outnumbered. One of the men was moving towards her, and Leo, his eyes cold and focused. There was no time, there was no escape. Acting on pure primal instinct, she did the only thing she could. She screamed, "Fire, the library's on fire." Her voice, raw with terror, cut through the noise of the gunshots. People on the street, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly panicked. The cry of fire in a crowded public space was a more powerful weapon than any gun. Chaos erupted. People began to run, to scream, creating a human tsunami that surged down the steps directly into the path of the attackers. Her would-be kidnapper was knocked off balance, momentarily disoriented by the stampede. It was the only opening Sal needed. He lunged, and the two men went down in a brutal tangle of limbs. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The remaining men, their plan in ruins, scrambled back to their cars and fled. In the aftermath, knelt on the cold stone, clutching a sobbing Leo, her body trembling so violently she felt it might shake apart. Dante was dead. Sal was bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. The illusion of safety was not just cracked, it was utterly shattered. When arrived, he moved through the police barricades and flashing lights like a phantom, his face a mask of such cold, controlled fury that even the seasoned detectives stepped aside. He knelt before her, his eyes scanning first Leo, then her, for any sign of injury. Finding none, he gently Leo from her arms and handed him to another of his men to be taken to the car. Then he helped to her feet, his grip on her arm like steel. He didn't say a word until they were inside the armored vehicle, the doors thudding shut, sealing them in a world of profound silence. He looked at her, his whiskey eyes burning with a terrifying light. "This ends now," he said, and it was the sound of a death sentence being passed. For the next 48 hours, a silent, merciless war was waged in the city's underworld. Unleashed the full, terrifying power of his organization. It was not a war of attrition, but of annihilation. The empire was systematically dismantled, their businesses burned, their lieutenants vanished, their alliances broken. By the second night had the head of the family, old man himself, kneeling before him in a deserted warehouse by the docks. What happened there would never know, and she never asked. Came back to the apartment just before dawn. He was wearing a different suit, but she could still smell the faint, metallic tang of blood and the cold finality of what he had done. He stood before her, the weight of his actions settling around him like a shroud. He looked exhausted, older, and utterly broken. "It's over," he said, his voice a raw rasp. He walked to the window and stared out at the first hints of morning. "I can't give you a normal life. I thought I could build a fortress high enough to keep the darkness out, but I was wrong. The darkness is me. It's in the foundations of everything I own." He turned to face her, his expression stripped bare of all artifice. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. "So I am giving you a choice, a real one. I have prepared everything. New identities for you and Leo, a trust fund that will ensure you never have to work another day in your lives. You can go anywhere in the world, Hawaii, Switzerland, a quiet town in the countryside. You tell me where and my people will take you there. You will be safe, truly safe, and completely free, and I will never see you again." He said the last words as if they were tearing him apart. "That is one choice." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "The other choice is that you stay. You stay with me and you accept what I am. You accept that our life will always have walls, that our peace will always be bought with violence, and that I am a monster who will burn the world down to keep you safe." He offered her the ultimate act of love, her freedom, the freedom to leave him. Tears streamed down his face, but they were not tears of fear. She looked at this man, this killer, this savior, who was willing to rip his own heart out to give her a life he could never be a part of. She walked towards him, stopping just before him, and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the frantic, desperate beat of his heart. She saw the man who showed a scared little boy how to build a Lego castle. She saw the man who had avenged her past and shared his own scars. She saw the man who loved her enough to let her go. "My choice," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "was made a long time ago. I'm not leaving." A sob escaped his throat, a raw, broken sound of disbelief and relief. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, his powerful frame shaking with the force of his emotions. He was her monster, and she was his salvation. Her love couldn't erase the darkness in him, but it gave him a reason to control it, to reshape it. It gave him a future. 1 year later stood on the terrace of a sprawling villa overlooking the sea, a place far from the city but still very much within the reach of Sempire. The air was warm and smelled of salt and jasmine. Below, on the private beach, she could see and Leo. They weren't building a castle of Lego, but one of sand, and Leo's bright, carefree laughter drifted up on the breeze, looked up and saw her watching, and a genuine, unguarded smile transformed his face. The darkness was still there, a shadow deep in his eyes, but it no longer consumed him. He had reshaped his world, pruning the most violent branches of his family's business, fortifying the legitimate enterprises, and building a new kind of empire, one of impenetrable power designed not for control but for the protection of his family. The peace they had was earned, not given. It was a peace built on a foundation of terrible violence, but it was their peace nonetheless. She knew the world outside these walls was still dangerous, but here, in the arms of the man who had spilled coffee on, the man who was both a king and a killer, she and her son were finally, truly safe. And they were home.